Imagine you are a prisoner who has not seen light for years. A guard brings you a gift, a polished silver platter. You look into it and see not your own reflection, but a perfect, star-filled night sky. A window to a world you've lost. For a single, beautiful moment, hope returns to you, right before you realize you are not looking at a reflection. You are looking into the severed eyes of a child. And the man who sent you this gift is about to show an entire city what true hell looks like. In the year of our Lord 1242, the Zecca Tower in Padua ceased to cast a shadow of hope upon the cobblestones. The stone from which it was built seemed to have absorbed not sunlight, but human suffering itself, bleeding a palpable chill into the humid summer air that even the bravest sparrows avoided. It was a monument to silence and an abyss for souls. Within, in the highest, windowless chamber, sat a man whose name had been scoured from the city's annals. He no longer recalled the turning of day into night, nor the taste of bread, nor the timbre of his own voice. His world had become four walls of sweating stone and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight upon his chest, broken only by distant screams that might have been his own. His memory was a ruin, a collection of fractured images without context, the scent of rain on dry earth, the warmth of a hand he could northwest longer place, the melody of a lullaby with forgotten words. These fragments brought no comfort. They were merely ghosts that emphasized the totality of his loss, mocking the hollowed-out vessel he had become in the suffocating, unbreathing darkness. One day, the door swung open without a single creak from its rusted hinges. A figure stood on the threshold, cloaked in darkness, its face a void beneath a deep hood. In its gloved hands, it held not food or water, but a silver platter, polished to a mirror sheen that seemed to gather and amplify the dungeon's gloom. It was an object of impossible beauty in a place defined by decay. The guard moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, its feet making no sound on the gritty floor. It placed the platter in the center of the cell and retreated as silently as it had appeared. The heavy bolt slid back into place, its final, echoing thud serving as the only acknowledgement of the visit. The prisoner was alone once more, but now the quality of the silence had changed. It was expectant. He crawled toward the object, his limbs stiff from disuse. The cold radiating from the metal was a shock to his skin. For a moment, he hesitated, his mind unable to process the intrusion. He expected to see his own reflection, a gaunt and bearded specter, the face of a man long dead to the world. He braced himself for the sight of his own ruin, a final confirmation of his complete degradation. But his own face was not what gazed back at him from the flawless surface. Instead, he saw a perfect, bottomless night sky. He saw constellations he dimly remembered from another life, a tapestry of stars so clear and brilliant that it felt as if he were looking into the very heart of the heavens. It was a vision of freedom so absolute, so pure, that it could not possibly exist above the tormented city of Padua. He stared for hours, forgetting the gnawing hunger in his belly, mesmerized by the cosmic panorama. He traced the lines of the dragon and the swan, a profound and painful beauty filling the void within him. The vision did not waver. It was not a hallucination born of starvation. The silver held a universe, a tiny, perfect window out of his stone cage, and for a fleeting eternity, he felt a flicker of something akin to peace. Then he leaned closer, his breath fogging a small patch of the impossible vista. The perspective shifted. He noticed the subtle curvature, the faint, organic texture that the starlight seemed to be projected upon. With a slow, dawning horror that began in the pit of his stomach and rose like bile, he understood. This was no reflection. This was not an illusion. They were eyes. The eyes of a child, resting on the silver platter. They had been excised from their sockets with a surgeon's impossible precision, so perfectly preserved that they held within their still, gelatinous lenses the last thing they had ever seen, a clear and beautiful night sky. And in their silent, cosmic gaze, the prisoner finally saw the true face of his captor. Padua had learned to live in whispers. The city's vibrant voice had been excised, leaving a hollow soundscape of shuffling feet and muted coughs. The Italian tongue, once a thing of song and passion, was now a dangerous tool, its words weighed and measured before being risked upon the stagnant air. Citizens moved through the streets as shadows. They clung to the walls, their bodies angled away from the open squares as if a great, unseen wind threatened to sweep them away. They learned the cartography of alleys and backways, mapping a new city defined not by landmarks, but by its blind spots. To catch another's eye was a transgression. A direct glance was an interrogation, an accusation, a potential death sentence. So people stared at the grimy cobblestones, at the chipped plaster of the walls, at their own worn shoes, anywhere but at the face of another human being. To be unseen was to be safe. Mothers clutched their children's hands with a desperate strength when passing the tyrant's palace. They would pull their little ones close, sometimes covering their eyes, as if the very sight of those dark, unadorned walls could leach the life from their young bodies. The stone itself seemed to radiate a malevolent cold. Children learned silence before they learned their prayers. They were taught not to run, not to shout, not to ask questions in the open street. Their games were played indoors, in hushed tones, their laughter stifled in their throats. They inherited a fear whose source they could not comprehend, a burden in their very bones. The architecture of the city began to reflect its soul. Hopeful, open balconies that once held flowers and lovers were bricked up, becoming flat, blind surfaces. No new homes were built with a view of the piazza. To look upon the center of power was to invite its gaze in return, and no one wanted that. Windows were sealed with heavy wooden shutters long before sunset. The evening light was locked out, and families lived in the flickering gloom of tallow candles. The city plunged itself into a voluntary darkness each night, a rehearsal for the final darkness that could claim any one of them at any moment. The only structures that continued to grow were those of control. New prisons rose like malignant tumors from the city's heart, their walls thick and windowless. And above everything, watchtowers stretched toward the sky, thin and black like the accusing fingers of skeletal hands. From their heights, unseen eyes watched. The sentinels in those towers never slept. They were a constant, silent presence, their gaze sweeping over the rooftops and streets below. Every citizen felt that gaze upon their back, a persistent pressure that straightened their spine and quickened their step. They were performers on a stage, their every move judged. The great market, once a riot of color and scent, now smelled only of fear. The rich aroma of baking bread, the sharp tang of spices, the sweetness of ripe fruit, all were smothered by the sour odor of collective anxiety. The air itself was thin and joyless, tasting of dust and apprehension. Merchants displayed their wares in silence. A transaction was a pantomime of pointing fingers and nodding heads. A woman wanting apples would simply indicate the basket. The seller would hold up the required number of fingers. There was no haggling, no friendly banter, no human connection. Coins were exchanged without a word. Money passed from one trembling, sweaty palm to another, the touch fleeting, almost repulsed. The clink of a coin dropping on a wooden counter was a shockingly loud event in the funereal quiet of the marketplace. It made people flinch, their heads snapping around. Even the birds seemed to sing more quietly in the gardens of Padua. The boisterous chorus of finches and larks had dwindled to a few hesitant chirps, as if the heavy blanket of dread that suffocated the city was smothering their song as well. Nature itself was holding its breath. The fear was not of the soldiers who marched in formation through the main thoroughfares. Their armor was frightening, their faces grim, but they were a known quantity, a visible threat. One could see them coming and step aside. The true terror was invisible, and it sat beside you at the dinner table. It was the awareness that any neighbor could be an informer. The blacksmith who owed you money, the weaver whose wife you had slighted years ago, the friend with whom you once shared wine and secrets. Any one of them could purchase their own safety with a carefully chosen word against you. Old grudges became weapons. A petty dispute over a property line could now be settled with a whisper in the right ear. A rival in business could be eliminated not through competition, but through accusation. The regime had weaponized the worst of human nature and turned it inward against the populace. Trust, the invisible mortar that holds a community together, had crumbled to dust. Families learned to censor themselves in their own homes. A father would not voice his frustrations to his son for fear the boy might innocently repeat his words outside. A husband and wife would fall silent when their own children entered the room. The home was no longer a sanctuary, it was merely a smaller, more intimate prison. The walls had ears, not literally, but metaphorically. Every word spoken had to be considered, every sentiment questioned. Love and affection were still possible, but they were expressed in a landscape of utter paranoia. No one knew for whom the armored fist would pound on the door in the dead of night. The arrests were arbitrary, their logic known only to the tyrant. It could be for a complaint about the price of grain, for a prayer said too loudly, or for no reason at all. The randomness was a tool of control, ensuring no one ever felt secure. Ezzelino's tyranny was not built upon the strength of his army or the height of his walls. It was a far more insidious structure, erected within the mind of each citizen. He had conquered not the city of Padua, but the soul of every person living within it. He had made them their own jailers. His power was absolute because it was decentralized. He did not need to watch everyone, for he had engineered a city where everyone watched each other. The million tiny terrors that nested in the hearts of his subjects, the fear of a neighbor, the suspicion of a friend, were the true pillars of his throne. It began on the doorstep of a family hollowed out by grief. One morning, where there had only been the grime of the street, a single white iris appeared. Its petals were a fragile rebellion against the gray stone, its stem a slender line of defiance. It was a thing of impossible beauty in a world that had outlawed it. It had been placed there in the deepest hour of the night, a furtive act of grace. A shadow, moving between the patrols, had stooped for a single, silent moment before melting back into the darkness. The act was a secret, a risk taken for a family that had already lost everything. By midday, another flower was found. It lay before the soot-stained door of the blacksmith whose wife had been taken, accused of witchcraft for a prayer she had whispered too loud. The brilliant white against the blackened threshold was a stark and silent accusation. Then another, and another. A quiet contagion of beauty spread through the city's veins. The flowers appeared on the stone lips of wells where those accused of treason had drawn their last drink of water. They bloomed on the doorsteps of the grieving, a shared and secret language of sorrow. They were even found outside the city walls, resting on the anonymous mounds of earth where the regime's victims were thrown without prayer or marker. Each flower was a name, a memory, a testament that someone had been loved and was now lost. This was not a revolt. There were no shouts, no banners, no swords. It was a silent reproach, a quiet act of disobedience so subtle it was almost impossible to punish. One could not arrest a man for picking a flower from a field. One could not prove he had placed it with defiant intent. The gesture was as ephemeral as a sigh, and as powerful. The city guards, instruments of blunt force, were confounded. Their first instinct was to ignore the phenomenon, to treat it as a strange but harmless anomaly. But the flowers kept appearing, their numbers growing each morning, a silent and spreading stain of purity. Orders came down from the palace. The flowers were to be removed. They were a blight, an unauthorized expression in a city where all expression was owned by the state. The patrols began a new, absurd duty, the culling of blossoms. They tore the irises from the doorsteps, their gauntlet hands clumsy and brutal. They crushed the delicate petals under the iron heels of their boots, grinding the white into the filth of the street. They wanted to erase not just the flower, but the very memory of its presence. But the next morning, they would be there again. For every flower they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. They were brought by dozens of unseen hands, a conspiracy of gardeners tending to the city's wounded soul. The act of placing the flower became as important as the flower itself. From his high window in the palace, Ezzelino could see them. The city he had painted in shades of gray and fear was now flecked with defiant white. He saw the small, bright dots on the doorsteps and along the riverbank, a rash of defiant hope. He watched his guards march on their pathetic patrols, their armor glinting as they stooped to commit violence against a flower. The sight did not amuse him. It filled him with a cold, intellectual fury that was far more dangerous than simple anger. He could not seize the hand of every person who plucked a flower. He could not place a guard in every garden and field. This was an enemy he could not see, a resistance he could not imprison. It was a ghost, and it was mocking him with beauty. This silent opposition, this floral epidemic, infuriated him more than an open rebellion. A mob with pitchforks could be cut down. A conspiracy could be tortured and broken. But how could one wage war against a gesture of grief? How could one silence a whisper that was never spoken aloud? His power was absolute, built upon a foundation of deafening silence and atomized fear. He had shattered the bonds of community, turning every man against his neighbor. He ruled a city of fearful individuals, not a unified people. But the flowers were readying those severed threads. Each blossom was a message passed from one grieving soul to another: you are not alone. we remember. We are still here. It was a silent conversation happening in plain sight, a language he could not decipher but whose meaning he understood perfectly. He felt the foundations of his authority, once as solid as the bedrock beneath his fortress, begin to shift. A hairline crack had appeared, not from the blow of a battering ram, but from the gentle pressure of 1,000 flower petals. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that it would spread. The response to the white irises was a procession. There was no announcement, no decree nailed to a church door. The command came as a fist on wood in the pre-dawn gray, a simple order to come outside, spoken in a flat, dead voice that promised no argument. 11,000 Paduans were pulled from their homes. Men, women, and the elderly were herded into the streets. There was no panic, no shouting. The city had been conditioned for this. A silent, shuffling compliance was the only currency of survival. They moved as a single, gray river of humanity, their bare feet whispering on the cold cobblestones. They were driven towards the Prado della Valle, a vast, open field just beyond the city walls. In another time, it was a place of fairs and festivals. Today, its wide, green expanse felt like a stage, an immense, empty space waiting to be filled with a performance of calculated cruelty. The open sky offered no comfort. There was no intention of a mass execution. A swift death was a mercy, and Ezzelino was not in the business of mercy. He had devised something else, an act of pedagogical horror. This was not a punishment, it was a lesson, and its curriculum was the anatomy of despair. The guards, with methodical, impersonal shoves, forced the massive crowd to form a gigantic circle. The human ring was 10 deep, a wall of flesh and fear. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath misting in the cool morning air, their eyes wide with a question they dared not ask. They were a captive audience. Into the center of this circle, another group was led. These were the children. They were the sons and daughters of those arrested on suspicion of treason, the children of families whose doorsteps had been graced by a white iris. They walked with a stumbling confusion, their small hands held by impassive guards. The parents in the circle watched, their bodies turning to stone. A cold dread, far deeper than the fear for their own lives, began to seep into their bones. They recognized their neighbors' children, and then, with a lurch of the heart that stole their breath, they saw their own. Then came the soldiers carrying the instruments. They brought portable braziers, the coals within glowing with a malevolent orange light. The heat shimmered in the air. And with them, they carried long, slender iron rods, their tips resting in the burning embers, slowly heating to a brilliant, incandescent red. The pieces of the nightmare clicked into place in the minds of the onlookers. A collective, silent gasp rippled through the circle, a wave of understanding so horrible it could not be given voice. They were not to be killed. They were to be made to watch. The first child was held fast. The soldier approached, the glowing poker held before him like a demonic scepter. The child's confused whimper turned into a sharp, piercing shriek of terror as he saw the heat, the impossible light. And then, before the petrified gaze of thousands of mothers and fathers, the lesson began. The red-hot tip of the iron rod was pressed against the soft, wet surface of the child's eye. There was a hiss, a puff of steam, and a smell of cooking meat that would haunt their dreams forever. The child's scream was cut short, replaced by a sound of pure, animal agony. The soldier was efficient. He moved to the other eye. 2 precise, deliberate movements. 2 moments of sizzling contact. The child was then released, a whimpering, ruined thing, to stumble blindly in the center of the field. A mother in the crowd tried to scream, but the sound was strangled in her throat. She collapsed, a puppet with its strings cut, but those around her, locked in their own paralysis, could not help. To break the circle was to invite an unknown, but certainly worse, fate. Then the next child was brought forward. And the next. The process was repeated with an industrial rhythm, a steady, horrifying tempo of suffering. The soldiers worked without emotion, their faces hidden behind their helmets. They were simply craftsmen at their terrible trade. The individual screams of the children began to merge. One shriek was joined by another, and another, until the air was filled with a single, monstrous wail. It was a sound that seemed to scour the inside of the skull, a constant, high-pitched wave of agony that seemed to have the power to split the heavens. From a hill overlooking the field, Ezzelino watched. He was not smiling. There was no pleasure on his face, no hint of sadistic glee. His expression was one of intense, focused concentration. He was an artist observing his masterpiece, a scientist studying the results of his experiment. He was not interested in the cruelty itself. He was interested in its effect. His gaze was fixed on the faces in the circle, the thousands of parents forced to bear witness. He watched their expressions shift from disbelief to horror, from horror to rage, and finally, from rage to a hollow, empty numbness. He wanted to do more than kill hope. Hope was a weed that could grow back from the smallest root. He wanted to cauterize the very soil of the soul from which hope could ever sprout. He wanted to burn the idea of it, the memory of it, out of their minds. He was turning his subjects into living dead, automatons of flesh capable only of obedience. He was severing the bond between parent and child, between love and protection, proving that in his Padua, even the most sacred instincts were powerless before his will. When the last child had been blinded, a sudden, shocking silence fell over the field. The great wail ceased, replaced by the low, lost sobbing of the sightless children stumbling in the grass. The soldiers stepped back, their work done. The iron rods cooled, their malevolent glow fading to black. The blinded children were left in a heap in the center of the circle, a writhing knot of pain and confusion. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the guards broke the circle, gesturing for the parents to go forward. They were permitted to retrieve what was left of their offspring. The parents stumbled forward like sleepwalkers, their faces blank masks of shock. They waded into the group of weeping children, calling out names, searching for the one that belonged to them, the one they had failed to protect. That day, the sun did not set over Padua. Its light was still there, a pale, indifferent glow in the sky. But for the 11,000 who walked back to the city, leading their blinded children by the hand, it had been blotted out. It was eclipsed by a cloud of despair so vast and so absolute that no light would ever penetrate it again. In the year 1256, the cup of patience, filled over decades with blood and tears, finally overflowed. The silent scream of northern Italy had at last reached the ears of Rome, and the world outside the walls of Padua could no longer feign ignorance of the evil that festered there. Pope Alexander IV, from his throne in the Lateran, issued a decree that sent a tremor through Christendom. He declared a crusade. Not against the infidel in the Holy Land, a distant and familiar foe, but against a single man. He declared a holy war against Ezzelino da Romano. The papal bull stripped him of his titles and his legitimacy. It named him a heretic, a schismatic, an enemy of God. But it went further, giving voice to the whispers that had haunted the tyrant for years. It called him the son of the devil, a cancer upon the body of the faithful that had to be cut out with fire and steel. This was not a war of territory, it was an exorcism. Armies from across the Lombard plain began to mobilize, led by his lifelong enemies and rivals. The banners of Este, of Pallavicini, of the Free Communes, once a fractured and bickering collection of states, now moved with a single, unified purpose. They marched on Padua, a coalition born of hatred and sanctified by the Church. Their steel was blessed, their cause righteous. They were coming to liberate the city, but more than that, they were coming to erase a stain from the soul of Italy, to pull down the men who had made a hell on earth. But the fall of the tyrant did not begin with the clang of a battering ram against his gates. It did not start with the flight of the first Crusader arrow. The collapse began as all such collapses do, not with a bang from without, but with a quiet, corrosive rot from within. It began with betrayal. His most trusted lieutenants, the very men who had enforced his will with brutal efficiency, were the first to turn. They were the architects of his terror state, the cold-eyed men who had overseen the tortures and carried out the purges. They had stood by his side, unflinching, for years. But they had also been closest to the fire, and they had seen the change in its nature. They saw his paranoia curdle from a tool of control into a self-consuming madness. He began to see traitors in the flick of an eye, conspiracies in the pattern of dust on a floor. His grip, once like iron, was becoming erratic. They saw that the engine of fear he had built was beginning to devour its own gears. His insatiable need for enemies was turning inward, and they knew, with the cold certainty of predators, that it would eventually turn on them. Their loyalty, a thing forged in fear and ambition, was no longer a shield. And so, in the shadows of the palace they had helped to build, they began to talk. Secret messages, carried by servants who knew how to be invisible, began to pass between his inner circle and the advancing Crusader army. Promises were made. Leniency was offered in exchange for a key, a gate, a moment of weakness. The intricate web of spies and informers that had been Ezzelino's true source of power began to tear. The threads, once sticky with fear and silver, grew brittle. The constant flow of whispers and accusations that had fed his paranoia and filled his dungeons slowed to a trickle, and then stopped. The silence that fell upon Padua was different from the silence of terror that had preceded it. It was a heavy, conspiratorial silence. The silence of a city holding its breath, not in fear, but in anticipation. The eyes that had been perpetually downcast now met for fleeting, significant moments in the street. And the people, those who had been ground down to the very nub of their humanity, began to change. The spectacle at the Prato della Valle had not broken them as Ezzelino had intended. It had pushed them through the floor of fear and into a cellar of cold, nihilistic rage. They had witnessed the absolute worst, the unimaginable. They had seen the light extinguished in the eyes of their own children. After such a thing, what could death possibly hold to frighten them? The fear of the executioner's axe was a pale shadow compared to the memory of the hissing poker. Life had become more terrifying than death. The daily existence of rising, eating, and sleeping under the tyrant's gaze was a continuous, unending torment. To die was simply to make it stop. And so, liberated from the fear of their own mortality, they became dangerous. During the opening days of the siege of Padua, Ezzelino himself was not there. He was away on campaign, subjugating another town, confident in the impregnability of his capital. He believed his fortress was secure, that his system of terror was a perfect, self-perpetuating machine. He returned with his army, drawn back by news of the Crusaders at his walls. He rode with an angry confidence, anticipating a long and satisfyingly brutal defense. He imagined his enemies breaking themselves against his stone walls, starved into submission, their holy cause rotting in the summer heat. He crested the final hill and saw his city. But something was wrong. The Crusader banners were not just outside the walls. They were on them. They flew from the very towers his men were meant to be defending. The field before the city was unnervingly quiet, the siege lines broken and disordered. He spurred his horse forward, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. As he drew closer, he saw it. The main gate, the massive iron and wood portal that he had considered as inviolable as the gates of hell, stood wide open. It was not broken or battered down. It was simply, calmly, open, an invitation to his enemies. His power, which had seemed as eternal and immutable as the mountains, had evaporated in a single night. His entire world, built on the sophisticated architecture of absolute terror, had been dismantled from the inside by the very people he had tormented. The structure was gone, leaving nothing behind. For he had built his house upon the sand of fear, believing it to be bedrock. He had never understood the final, immutable law of his own dark physics, that fear, when compressed beyond its limits, when refined into a thing of pure and total despair, does not create obedience. It undergoes an alchemy. It is reborn as fury. On a September day in the year 1259, at the Battle of Cassano d'Adda, the final act played out. His army, a hollowed-out shell of its former glory, depleted by desertions and starved of the fear that had once fueled it, was shattered. The battle was a rout, a bloody, chaotic end to a reign of surgical terror. Ezzelino himself fought with a cold, detached fury, not as a commander but as a simple soldier seeking an end. But an end was not granted to him. An archer's arrow found his leg, not his heart. He fell from his horse, his momentum carrying him into the mud of the riverbank, and he was captured. His enemies, the lords of the neighboring cities he had long terrorized, gathered to look upon their prize. They saw not a monster, but a man in his 60s, bleeding in the dirt, his face a mask of weary contempt. There was no fear in his eyes, only a profound and unsettling stillness that unnerved them. They debated his fate, their voices giddy with the possibilities of vengeance. The desire was not for a quick death. That would be a wasted opportunity. They envisioned a grand spectacle of retribution, a traveling pageant of justice that would cleanse the lands he had polluted with his presence. They would put him in an iron cage, just large enough to stand, and parade him through every city he had ever ravaged. The people could come and see their tormentor brought low. They could throw stones and filth, they could scream the names of their dead at him, they could reclaim their stolen dignity. After the tour, the true artistry of their revenge would begin. They would subject him to the same torments he had inflicted upon his thousands of victims. The hot irons, the rack, the slow, methodical deconstruction of the human body that his dungeons had perfected. They would make his end a masterpiece of suffering. He was taken to the castle of Sansino and thrown into a dungeon, bound in heavy chains. The stone was damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and defeat. But for Ezzelino, who had spent his life orchestrating the suffering of others in such places, it was simply a familiar environment. Physicians were summoned immediately. His captors were adamant that he should not die from his wound. He was needed alive, his body a canvas upon which they would paint their revenge. They came to him with clean bandages, salves, and instruments, their faces a mixture of professional concern and personal revulsion. But Ezzelino simply looked at them. His eyes were flat, devoid of expression. He watched their movements as one might watch the pointless scurrying of insects. When they offered him water, he turned his head. When they brought him bread, he ignored it. His silence was more powerful than any curse. He refused all food, all medicine, all aid. When the physicians, under orders from their lords, attempted to treat his wound against his will, he fought them with the last of his strength. He ripped off the bandages they applied. He spat out the potions they tried to force between his lips. He had taken complete control of the only thing left to him, his own body. His life and his death were now his final weapons, and he would wield them with the same precision he had once used to command his armies. His captors could chain his limbs, but they could not command his will. For 11 days, he lay on the stone floor, slowly, deliberately dying. It was not the festering wound in his leg that was killing him, it was his own resolve. He was starving himself, dehydrating himself, actively willing his own life to cease. Each dawn, his jailers would find him weaker, but his eyes were just as clear, just as defiant. His enemies grew frantic. Their grand spectacle was slipping through their fingers. Each day he survived was a victory for him and a humiliation for them. They had captured the monster, but they could not control him. He was directing the final scene, and they were merely frustrated spectators. On the 12th day, he died. He passed not in a delirium of fever or agony, but in a quiet, final exertion of will. He had denied his enemies the satisfaction of their justice. He denied them the sound of a single groan of pain, the sight of a single tear of regret. He denied them his death. He had taken everything from them, their families, their homes, their peace of mind. And then, at the very end, in a final, sublime act of absolute contempt, he had stolen his own death from their grasp. He left them with nothing but their victory, which now felt as hollow and as cold as his empty chains. He left behind a void, a silence where a scream of retribution should have been. And in that void grew a frustrated, impotent hatred. It was a hatred that had been denied its catharsis, a rage with no object left to vent itself upon. And in its own way, this cheated, unslaked vengeance was a torment more profound than any he could have devised for them himself.